Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host Mitchell J. Rabin, and we're very glad that you're joining us again today. Today we're going to have another very interesting show. We have Chelsea Flor on with us today, who has extensive expertise in the sacred sciences, going back to the ancient mystery schools of every major and not so well-known civilization on this planet. I'm talking about the Atlantean, the Egyptian, the Tibetan, and others. She has made an extensive study of secret doctrines that are at the base of all teachings, all wisdom traditions, and the principles of life itself. So she's going to be speaking with us today about the nature of man on this planet, some of the history of us here, and then going into some understanding and conversation about the nature of sacred geometry, that is, some of the mathematical principles that underlie our existence here, and how by studying them, becoming familiar with them, we can exercise some greater leverage, if you will, in our lives. So Chelsea, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, indeed, for welcoming me here.
Good. Good. Did I hit upon some of the major chords
Yes,
there?
you did, indeed. And
Okay.
this will fully envelop quite a study that takes lifetimes to do.
Absolutely. In fact, that's a really important point. What we're going to be talking about today and what Chelsea will be informing us about is you've heard the phrase, the tip of the iceberg. It's like one electron in a sea of atoms. And I think it's really important to know that, and at the same time to allow what she has to say to enter you directly and enjoy what it is and let it, create the synapses that will take place inside you. But please know there's a whole body of knowledge which will over time be coming out on A Better World, and we're probably going to be doing a whole separate to get to the bottom of what Chelsea knows. It'll take a while, but it's worth it. So on that note, why don't we start with a simple question like, what, Chelsea, is, from an esoteric point of view, the role of man on this planet?
Man. What is man?
Human. Truly human.
The hue man. I mean, you did hit a note that should be interpreted. Hue means the auric field, the colors of man, the colors that we interpret as the potential fields of energies that emanate from these wonderful chakra centers around and within our body.
Hue as in H-U-E? That
Or
notion?
H-U.
Or H-U, okay.
And also is the true name of the Sphinx in Egypt. So the Sphinx, which was a Greek word given to that wonderful archetype that guards all of the ancient wisdom,
Yes.
was really the guardian of man. The records, whether they be manifested in the physical, are really something that needs to be interpreted in the finer qualities of what we call the principles of brain chemistry, the transmutation and the ascension of man. And we have heard these wonderful ways of displaying evolution and the tools that will allow us to perceive that evolution can take place. There are many modalities, many healings, many ways to interpret this.
I had the thought that hue is related to the ancient Greek, related to the delicious garbanzo bean, hummus, and that it's related to the idea in Greek, the word chthonic, relating to the earth, from which we also get the word humble, humility. Is that so, etymologically?
It's wonderful to look at syntax and begin to create what you would call derivation of similar sounds, colors, tones that have a root in the same doctrine. So, again, we're talking about ancient history here, written in the form of symbolism, written in the form of colors, frequencies, and a whole potential that unfolds into what you would call an arcane science. We have models that we call solids. We have a whole system of interpretation in sacred alphabets we call waveforms. All of this is hidden in a potential frequency that is a full octave divided into many overtones that we call music. And geometry is nothing more than frozen music. And when we begin to interpret what is man's role in all this. And we,
Yes.
being the sentient being, who are we really? Where did we come from, and where are we going?
That's the question on the table.
What we truly need to do is discuss essence. The spiritual embodiment is the physical form.
Mm-hmm.
Where did essence come from? Well, there are many ways to give you a metaphor for this, and the secret doctrines display this in their symbolism. They call it the first movement of spirit out of the void, based upon a symbolic representation of the mundane egg, or the so-called sphere, with the dot in the center.
Mm-hmm.
When we first become aware, we begin to move and rotate out of that awareness, and we self-reflect.
This is sort of like one of the original creation myths, in a sense.
Well, it's a metaphor for what actually does happen.
Right, okay.
Because sound, being the architect for all of the matter world, was the first subtlest vibration that began movement.
Okay.
And so metaphorically, the only way for our minds to begin to understand movement is simply saying, if there were carved a sphere in a sea of jello, and how do you describe what is the differential between what is inside and what is out? You cannot unless there is a rotation that creates the first movement.
Mm-hmm.
So that first rotation gives you a different perspective as to what you are and what is outside of you.
Definitely.
So symbolically, this is represented as the mundane egg. We now have created an interference of deciding what is within and what is without.
It creates the distinction
Yes,
between.
absolutely.
It's like the Li, which is the line in the middle of the yin and the yang. It's the first thing that creates distinction, division between.
And with that comes the whole polarity-minded consciousness as well. And it's a separation from the Godhead.
Yes.
So we continue our journey through consciousness, creating a wave form. And from this comes the first archetype that sets up the potential interference patterns through the subtle vibrations that we want to call the subharmonics of phonon versus photon. Photon being the first subtle particles that create matter. Phonon being the wave that creates...
The sound wave.
Creates the intellectual pattern that harnesses light, distills it, creates the modality that allows for the sacred form to be. Without the interference pattern, there is no intelligence.
Wow. Could you go back to just defining what is the interference pattern again?
If we have one movement, we have a ripple that begins from that movement and continues off into the void. It knows
it's
nothing.
It's like dropping a pebble into a lake.
That's right. It continues on forever.
Sure.
Unless you have the second pebble that drops, that creates a wave on top of that.
Oh, okay. And that's where you get the interference?
Then you have an interference pattern.
Okay.
With that comes two intelligences coming together to form creation.
I see.
And
is that where you get male and female?
almost.
Or we're not there yet? Okay.
Well, first of all, the waveform, symbolically, like you said, the yin and the yang, would give you the first division of inside and out.
Yes.
And this also sets up the potential idea of the agreement of time. And the first fractal of that intelligent waveform, sets up the first full octave of the universe, now that becomes segmented into the many divisions of what we call the full alpha and omega, recreating the cycle over and over again based upon the periodicity of orbital mechanics. Now remember, we said sphere, rotation,
cycle.
Anytime anything begins to revolve, there is a cycle.
That's right.
And with that cycle comes the periods of growth, evolution, and eventual return to source. And that, as a sentient being, we're always looking to go home. We're looking to achieve greater joy in our life, to achieve balance, and to achieve the individualization of what we would interpret as what is evolution, what is transition, what is ascension, and what is the transforming self that wants to return back to the source that we call God.
Absolutely.
And in our process of becoming, and we're always in this process of becoming if we're on the path, your God only knows what you know and could never know more than what you speak of. And you want to place this in a path that you try to achieve through intent.
Nice. Nice. So evolve actually itself means to turn out, which means there's a turning
Yes.
out of which we come and, basically realize ourselves.
And as we map the growth,
Mm-hmm.
we get the archetypal structures that we're familiar with if we study some of the ancient doctrines. And the first primal archetype would be the mother principle of the sphere, being the mundane egg. And from her, she recreates herself into a movement outside of self, the polarity-mindedness that actually would create the archetypal structure two-dimensionally as a Vesica Pisces. And simultaneously, the Father and the Son are created. And this becomes the Holy Trinity.
Mm.
And if most people do not understand what a Vesica Pisces is, you could see it two-dimensionally as two circles that are interacting with the edges touching each other's centers. Or to really interpret it three-dimensionally, they're both spheres doing the same thing. And the interference pattern of both of them is the segment in between that creates the child.
Yes, because the interference, another word, is also intersection.
Yes.
Okay. Both with the ripples in the lake as well as here with the two
Absolutely.
spheres. Yeah.
And so that
Creating a third.
that is the intellectual pattern that sets up the whole mapping of movement out of the void.
Wow. There's, as you're speaking, I know you're coming from the Atlantean Egyptian tradition, but I'm hearing it as Chinese cosmology because the same mapping is in the Chinese as well.
At the highest level of every mystery school,
Yeah.
the secret doctrines are always the same. But each one had a way of hiding through their secret codes, through their languages,
Yeah.
and their interpretation system became what we would want to call, as a theologist, a religion. And that is far from the original truth of what it was really trying to display.
Interesting. So the religion actually became a vehicle for hiding,
Yes, indeed.
distinct from expressing and revealing. Yeah.
That's right.
Very interesting. Sure, it became cloaked. Yeah. Now, to go back into... let me just ask first. This original mother expression, the archetype, seems related to an idea I ran across with Erich Neumann in The Origins of Consciousness, where he speaks about the Orborus, which is like the original egg, really.
The snake Orborus,
Yes.
the snake that eats its tail.
How is that related to what you're saying?
It's almost like I said that the fractals of time are a complete unity that when segmented can be, I guess, distinguished as take the whole eternity as one complete octave. And then you segment them in various different ways that give you proportions. And from all of these different proportions, one would build upon another to create a fractal. And so all of our periodicities out there, which are cycles within the heavens, are always
Lunar, stellar, solar,
Right.
etc.
And it's one circle within another circle within another circle. within
Concentric
another
circles.
circle. Or a spiral,
Or spiral.
depending upon the point of view or where you are in the alpha and the omega principle. That's what the snake Orborus represented, the alpha and the omega.
Got it. Okay. Wonderful. Now, could you describe from Blavatsky's point of view in particular what the evolution of humanity has been, in a sense, where we're coming from and where we're going?
That would mean that we need to truly rewrite history in order for people to understand the
Yeah.
concept of root
We need to do
race.
that anyway. So it's all right.
Indeed. And coming from her point of view, she was one of the very fortunate few that was schooled in the Eastern and the Western philosophies and understood the secret doctrine from both points of view and commanded a minimum of 10 languages to begin to deliver the message to the New World. And the New World began as the Age of Aquarius, based upon periodicity in the year of 1881. And when she began her trek, and went through the many different journeys that an initiate would take, she understood that this was her task of delivering and bridging together the Western and the Eastern philosophies. And so to an Eastern philosopher, one would determine cycles of heaven as being the symbolic representation. To a Western, he would take the macrocosm and the microcosm and interpret it from the center of the being. And so they would use chemistry for the process rather than, looking at the yogi that goes for the deep meditation and wants to purify the body and then purify the mind. Well, they understood that there were other ways of doing the same thing that would bypass the other. And it's a matter of interpretation. It's a matter of consciousness and energy at all levels. And so what we have now is a full display of tools of initiation.
Yeah.
And to walk every path means that you have complete education in all the ways that one would have choice. It doesn't matter how you get there.
They all meet in the middle.
They do. And that is the snake that eats its tail. We all get there. It's just a matter of choice.
Very
and we pick and
interesting.
choose what we need to know in the moment.
Now, if you could just, because since this first question I asked Chelsea had to do with what is humanity's role in this whole game we refer to as life, quite casually, she had a very interesting way of kind of laying out the ages. And I was wondering, if it's possible to kind of just lay that out rather briefly right before we dovetail into some sense of geometry, which will be a prelude to our speaking about alchemy and chemistry of the brain and the human body in the next show.
Indeed.
Okay. Is that possible? Is it
Yes, to briefly
doable?
state history, it has been known that the formation of life forms that were sentient on this planet have a history that go back years with what we call the elder race. And since then, we have had many ages that have gone through the dark and the light, which means that we had great upstarts of humanity again that we would condition and term a root race. The one that we really fully need to be integrated with as far as history goes is the one prior to the one we're living in now, the former world. And that we would be determined by what most people would understand to be the age of Atlantis and Lemuria. They had a very long history on this planet and have left a great legacy of knowledge embedded in sacred sites and ancient doctrine. And these are...
And the Egyptian civilization altogether.
Absolutely. And these are symbolically represented secretly and encoded in waveform, alphabets, petroglyphs, hieroglyphs, the interpretation of the periodicity of the sun, moon, stars in their revolution around the planet as we begin to pick and choose these sacred sites for their demarcation of solar arc progression at solstices, equinoxes.
And you are able to, and others have been able to, trace this directly to Atlantean knowledge.
Absolutely.
Is that intuitive on your part, or is that archaeological on your part?
Without fully understanding it myself, most of what I know has been innate and there. I instinctively knew it. I have chosen my path to validate that, which meant an awful lot of research and study to say, yes, someone else knew instinctively what I know, and now I had to prove it. And again, hence came studying all the sacred sciences and mixing and blending it with an interpretation system that allows for the modern academic sciences to bridge the gap in consciousness.
Interesting. Okay. So with that said, how do we then integrate the Atlantean Lemurian age into present consciousness so we make the proper evolutionary movement upward?
An excellent point, and this is really getting to the crux and the reason for being. It's called evolution, and it's based upon the brain's capacity to know it all. And we are stuck in a modality that does not allow for the full function of the brain. Remember evolution. You would not have the full size brain had we not used it at one time. which means that we had fallen asleep, or we were conditioned or entrained not to think beyond the patterns of what they call third density world, or the three lowest aspects of brain functionality, based upon the three lower chakras. And what we're learning to interpret now is bridging the gap, which is the heart chakra, which unfolds all the higher principles. And with that comes also the higher functionings of brain chemistry, based upon the precious jewels of the ductless glands, which give you the geometries of the elixirs created in the body. The term hormone is a direct relationship
related to harmony.
Yeah. And with harmony comes the full embodiment of the octave. And when the octave is completed in the brain chemistry unfolds as a new geometry in a crystalline matrix that allows for right and left brain hemisphere to instinctively develop the higher potentials of man. And at this point we're talking about what one would definitely relate to as supernormal
Consciousness,
powers.
parapsychology,
That's right.
telepathy,
All of the above.
levels beyond the normal scope.
That's right. And to the Eastern, he would call it the great cities, meaning
Right.
the highest aspect of that would be what would be determined as the supernatural powers of bilocation and ascension.
Sure.
And of course the transmutation of the physical body into what you would term the light body, taking on that new garment of light.
Sure. Or what I would imagine also in shamanic language and traditions, the changing, transmutation of substances such that a person could become an animal or a bird.
Shape-shifting.
Shape-shifting, yes.
And that indeed is a function of being able to take the spiritual light body out of the physical vehicle and walk into or create an animal form because of the natural instinctive power that that animal has. Mainly because the culture identifies with it. You need to identify a communicative device which allows for that which you are triggering to have some kind of impact or an effect on that consciousness.
Absolutely. Now, what then, as it's clear that the development of the 4 higher chakras, and I don't want to limit all the chakras to 7 anyway, but just for the sake of this conversation, what is the role of the lower ones to the higher ones at this point, at this evolutionary turn we're at?
In order to just survive on this planet, we only need to know that we exist and to identify with it. Hence comes the root chakra. The second chakra being that of the procreational functions of the sexual organs. And the third of the solar plexus allows for the recreation of victim, tyrant, pain, pleasure, and all the polarity consciousness that's out there. You only need those 3 to survive. And with that comes the instinct of our cellular memory. But for those that begin to awaken into the deeper consciousness of cellular memory, means that they have done the cycles of pain and pleasure and victim tyrant too many times not to want to take it further. So they begin their journey into the heart. The heart space opens up, and through the encompassment of what I would call the elixir of love, it begins to stimulate and energize the lower chakras into a blending of their hormones and harmonies, triggering the subtlest aspect of Kundalini. And when this life force principle, which is what it truly is, begins to trigger and move up the spine, all of the chakras begin to open. And step by step, you unfold like the petals of a lotus. And with this comes the elixir of the secret flower.
Right. Like the secret of the golden blossom, golden flower of the Chinese.
Yes,
and
the blooming of the lotus.
Exactly.
The cave of Brahma opening up the golden bowl.
Sure.
Yes,
sure.
all of the above.
That's beautiful, absolutely. And yet there has to be a role, I know there's a role for the lower chakras to be very much harmonized with the upper ones. So they're not being denied because that mean the cessation of life as we know it in a physical body, but really integrated. But that sex of all of them, which seems that it's clearly the most, the deepest basal chord, primal chord we've got, the basis of Kundalini rising anyway, can be utilized in a very harmonious way to both enjoy the sexual pleasure that is havable, realizable, but at the same time in service to the opening and flowering of the higher chakras.
Yes. My interpretation system that I love to relate to would be understanding first what mantra, sound, is, what yantra, symbolic or geometrical representation is, into tantra, which is understanding the life principle of the human form and how we are to interpret all this and to become fully potentialed, to live tantra.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. Wow. Okay, this is exciting because this is really nicely, Chelsea, setting up the next show, which is going to be to get into the dynamics of the brain chemistry as they are informed both hormonally as well as alchemically by the introduction of certain substances into the body that you are quite familiar with and can be found in the periodic table as well as in the periodic table of our bodies. So it's the earth and the body as one.
And what it means to become evolved into the fourth principle or the fourth frequency or the fourth dimension. I mean, all of these are archetypal consciousness interpretation systems out there that we need to understand at a level that's basic in the matter world. Transmutation.
Absolutely. The one thing that we didn't give much time to here was the role of geometry, although you made reference to it in terms of the crystalline structure in the brain, which we'll be speaking about next time, and the ductless glands, that there's a certain geometry you've referred to gets set up. Can you give us a word? I know it's unfair, but a word about what do you mean when you say that? What is it about shape that has implications for us?
Think in terms of matter as being the mother. Mother, matter.
Mater.
That's right. And father as being the pater, or pata, or pater, depending upon which interpretation of language you choose. It's the condensation of light into matter that allows for us to be.
Yes, it's a contraction, yeah.
But with that comes the idea that matter had to have an intellectual pattern that allowed for it to congeal. And the congealing of matter is basically mapping where the affinity principles allow for the close packing of this matter to come together. We're talking about setting up the whole pre-states of matter geometrically and how it unfolds into the interpretation system of what we call third density awareness, or our periodic table that establishes the grid for a three-dimensional reality.
That was a dynamite sentence because you actually congealed and concisely congealed the notion of sacred geometry, virtually in a sentence. And of course it can be expanded upon quite infinitely, but if we listen to that over and again, we got it. Beautiful. Thank you. So look, we'll continue on and get into chemistry and alchemy. And I want to thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Really a pleasure. This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World. Thanks so much for joining us. We've been speaking with Chelsea Flor about, well, you just heard it. Stay tuned because we're going to be continuing very soon next week with more on this subject. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Use of the word. Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and we're very glad that you're joining us again today. Today we are going to continue with Chelsea Flor talking about the nature of the ancient world and the implications of the wisdom teachings for us today. It's a huge overarching subject which we're going to be going into in a very specific way, in a very practical way, in fact. Chelsea, who has an extensive background, for those of you who didn't see the last show, in sacred science, coming from Atlantis, Egypt, Tibet, and the Western tradition in general, is going to be leading us on a foray, so to speak, into consciousness and how to ignite it so that we are using ourselves to full capacity. Okay?
Wonderful.
Welcome, Chelsea.
Thank you again for having me.
Absolutely. So, to begin this odyssey, how would we like to proceed in understanding the relationship of the human kingdom to the plant mineral kingdoms so we can excite our consciousness to its fullest height?
We need to back it up just slightly. The humanness of who we are had to have gone through many different stages of evolution in order to be present in the moment that says we're on the verge of something very special here, which means a graduation of who we are into what we perceive to be the next evolutionary leap. And with this comes the interpretation through not only oral tradition of the secret doctrines, but the science of recreation of the elixirs within the body and how to jumpstart this, trigger, and allow for the transmutation of the animal and the plant kingdom inside the body to reconstruct our genetic material and unfold our DNA into its proper, I would say, accelerated state.
Proper.
Yes.
Meaning the way it's supposed to be other than the way it is now?
Well, genetic material is a funny thing. We ended the last show talking about the brain capacity.
Yes.
And how it was shut down into the lower three aspects of only functioning accordance to
survival mode.
Survival mode, yes indeed. And with it, it's only being triggered, the neurons are only fired at the lower levels, which means what you need to do to go through social consciousness is to be at that level. To be an initiate, which is one who decides to take a path or a journey down a particular road that allows for consciousness to unfold into these great many paths, meant they had to have
the higher levels.
That's right. He meant to have had some event in his life that transformed him.
Mm-hmm.
So that transformation created an elixir in the brain of excitation, of opening up the neurons to perceive a higher functionality. In other words, it's like opening up a window, but you don't know how to fly out that window yet. So you perceive a brand new world out there, and the initiate takes the journey as a fool, and hopefully becomes a magician.
Mm-hmm.
And this interpretation system was laid out in the higher arcana of the tarot.
Mm-hmm.
The tarot meaning rota. It is a cycle of allowing for the unfoldment of the journey of man to trigger all the wonderful hormones in the body to eventually become a magician. But what was not spoken about through these oral traditions was during the earlier process of the fool, he would take a journey of learning to purge the body through what you would call the meditations, the disciplines, the things that we
fasting.
Consider, that's right, the hard route. What I'm about to unfold to most
spiritual disciplines
is that there are shortcuts. And being that we feel that we're at this millennia, the end times, if you want to call it, the study of eschatology, and even the book of Revelations is directly related to the 22 higher arcana of the initiate's journey from the fool to the magician. And what we're seeing here unfold is also the greater picture of the demise of Atlantis. And if through all of this, the purposeful intent for evolution is not to recreate what happened in Atlantis, but to create a new heaven on earth, based upon the ability of man's consciousness to rise above the level that we now consider to be just social consciousness,
mm-hmm.
and through a 100th monkey effect, a certain
Social as in virtually survival consciousness,
yes,
is that?
absolutely.
Okay.
100th monkey effect. If enough people create a grid of consciousness, then the rest will get it. And those that choose the path will allow for this to unfold.
Mm-hmm.
And the tools that we now have accessible to us that are now being unfolded and are being made aware of in these circles, if you want to call it these small little metaphysical schools that are now new Neoplatonist
Popping
schools,
up all
popping
over
up all
the
over,
planet.
It's a wonderful idea that it's never been kept secret, but our ability to interpret the symbolism that was so arcane, the codices are now being revealed. And teachers are stepping forward to create a path that allows for the initiate to be open to the sacred knowledge. And what we're about to discuss is brain chemistry, and about Kundalini, and about the opening up of the higher functions of the chakra from the heart above, which corresponds to brain functions. And when we look at what we have accessible to us, the three-dimensional grid gives us wonderful kingdoms to work with.
Let me just understand one thing, Chelsea, before we go on, which is because you linked that kind of graduation at the point of millennium and the entire tarot deck, in a sense, being fleshed out before us for us to go from the fool to the jester. I mean, the fool to the magician, by way of the jester. You also mentioned Atlantis, and not to recreate what happened in Atlantis.
Yes.
But was it so that the Atlanteans had the upper four chakras running, or were they also locked into, lower patterns? I mean, I know the common idea is that they got too, in a sense, mental, and they left the heart out, and they thought everything could be solved by technology. Well, that's my understanding. And so they ended up, sinking their ship, no pun intended, and literally. And so we sure know that a path without a heart is not a path worth following at all. That means that the hormones, the ductless glands around there, etc., and the energy of the heart wasn't present, certainly enough to keep Atlantis afloat. So is that part, you're saying that we're going to be redirecting our energy, yes, so we do not recreate that?
They certainly held command of what we would call the periodic table and the release of atomic structure, which meant transmutation at the most powerful level of the nucleus. And we have instrumentally, in the last 50 years or so, have begun our experimentations in the release of nuclear matter, as well as the trying to transmute the gold, yes, into the archetypal embodiment of what we call the wisdom of the philosopher's stone. Hence, we get the terms occultum, white powder gold, the elixirs of the ancients that gave us either the eternal youth, which is determined by the tin and oak of the Celtic way, or, Alexander's journey was in search of the fountain of youth. They wanted to know, was it a reality, immortality in the physical way, or was there something else that we were not fully understanding
beyond the body,
the path of the body? And with this came the whole interpretation for me of, through the waveforms of the hieroglyphics and the hieratic texts of the ancient papyrus of the Egyptians in the Book of the Dead, was to me an alchemical table listing a whole codice of occult ways to recreate the patterns of the higher functions of the brain.
Okay.
So we're talking about
go into it.
rebirthing the body through chemistry.
A better life through chemistry. Okay. So what was it suggesting?
It was suggesting that after you went through the disciplines of the long periods of
arduous
school,
disciplines,
they would call this the right horse, the right eye of Horus versus the left eye of Horus. With this came, you had to first learn the arithmetic and the geometry of music. Then you had to understand the symbolism behind the archetypal waveform that allowed for the symbols to be a written visual language. And with this written visual language, there were tonal qualities that allowed for the keys and the locks
to be open.
To be open, indeed. And the Egyptian hieratic text, if most people are not familiar with, is a full octave of 144 waveforms that unfolded all this process. 45th was the scarab, which meant that now the initiate crawled himself into the dung and hence was self-begotten. Recreated the body anew.
Yes.
So you had to understand the interpretation of all of the tones, colors, frequencies, and chemistries that are apparent in all the kingdoms available to us. And what we did was synthesize this into geometrical monoatomic atoms based upon the principles of the mineral and the plant kingdom. Hence, we get the many schools out there, such as the white powder gold, so-called platinum group elements that are, small geometrical alignments that allow for geometry to be what you would term interdimensional, something that is wavering between third and fourth dimension.
So I'm going to just translate a little bit. This also is referred to as manna from heaven,
Yes.
is it not? Okay. So basically, we have a situation in which we are now at a time period like either none or few before, wherein not only through arduous labors and disciplines of meditation, Tai Chi Chuan, fasting, and the rest of the yogic disciplines that we know of, and others, prayer included, we can now, in a sense, take a quantum leap in consciousness. So we go directly into the space between the third and the fourth dimensions, fourth dimension of which is where we're heading anyway, but we can do it through the introduction of a certain kind of brain nutrition, you could say.
Yes.
Right? Which actually all have the original recipes are from the ancients.
Yes.
So what then is the white powder of gold, and what does it do to the body, in a sense, as we think of Kundalini doing to the brain?
Okay. What we will have are so-called recipes hidden behind the so-called white lion, red lion, and green lion.
Okay.
And hence the lion is indeed the Sphinx. And the whole interpretation of the Sphinx being the guardian of the mysteries is indeed coveting and keeping sacred the idea that you do not have these powerful substances unless you are impeccable, which is why you are geared towards the disciplines of the recapitulation of ridding the body.
Cleansing,
That's right.
organizing,
The emotional body.
realigning.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So, but we're coming to find that time is of the essence. And those that are adhering to these schools of thought, if their ego is kept at the door, they are now able to open up the new gateways and to keep power in a balance. Because power is a wonderful thing if you know how to use it, and we will be tempted by power. Because indeed what will be happening is the unfoldment of a magnificent ability to first, the psychic centers will open and we'll find ourselves communicating interdimensionally, which is happening within the last couple decades, that we are receiving cosmic energy and messages from those that are interdimensional. Step number one. We see this as an indoctrination through the many archetypal UFO studies out there, or extraterrestrial type of influence here on this planet. And of course the channeling and the ways of clairvoyance and clairaudience that allow for the connectiveness interdimensionally. That means that psychical centers of the brain are now beginning to develop.
Getting activated.
Yes. And so we take that step as leading man into a process. The second step would be the full development of seership. Now, seership means that you have to develop the eyes to be able to see the interdimensionality that's out there, which means the overtones that go beyond the small sliver of the colors of the rainbow that we call Roy G. Biv. Here we have the full electromagnetic spectrum available to us. From the subtle properties of electromagnetic spectrum, hence, are the relationship of the 144 archetypes of the waveforms. With this comes a harmonic balance of, like striking a chord, have the ability through geometry that when certain geometries come together, recreate the elixirs pulled out of either a plant or the mineral kingdom, then when recombined, alter and create, like the brain is a radio, a new crystal that will now achieve cosmic radiation and interpret this as a higher thought form. We can now send and receive at this higher level based upon what we take in as nutrition.
Wow. Okay, I'm just going to reinterpret a little bit, just a little bit, because that was really quite clear. But if I could just encapsulate a little bit. Through, just a little, through better nutrition, pulling upon, extracting from the mineral, animal, vegetable kingdoms, when these are recombined in the human kingdom, we will be activating, a word I like better than developing. I have a feeling it's already developed. It's just dormant. Activating certain neuroreceptors, sites in the brain, not only in the brain, in the entire body, which is where the nervous system is, that will, in a sense, activate, coat, inform on a chemical and electromagnetic level so that we become the real antennae that we really are.
Indeed.
Receiving from every single intergalactic cosmic stratum that exists.
Indeed,
Yeah.
Indeed, we are the archetypal structure of the many platonic solids that we call crystalline coherence.
That's right. And in fact, we're creating a new geometry internally, literally in our brain. And the skull, of course, is such an interesting thing, housing, because the bone conducts sound.
Absolutely.
So we're restructuring our entire skeletal system in a sense as well.
Well, let me add a very unique way of connecting that.
Yeah. Please.
The matrix of calcium carbonate, which is pretty much the basic constituent of the mineral content of our bones,
Yes.
has a geometrical shape in form of an octahedron, which is actually 51-51 angled, or a squashed octahedron, which is perfectly in resonant to that of the Great Pyramid of the planet, which is the number system that gives us all the measures of the world. So here we are, being the interpret and resonating perfectly with that of the calcium carbonate casing stones that surround and create the pyramid. Now that is an antenna for cosmic radiation, which is why it was chosen to be an initiatory site to bring in and harness through the geometry the waveform of energy that allows for the coherent pattern to arc through the brain when one is lying in the coffer or the sarcophagus in the king's chamber. So we're talking geometry at its finest level to trigger brain chemistry. So is that not alchemy in a different way?
Yes. Yes.
So another way of triggering that would be to ingest the same alchemy to trigger the neurons to fire in that response.
Yes.
Now, incidentally, it should also be understood that the truncated pyramid means that the violet ray is missing. As in a prism, the apex of the prism is where the violet ray is harnessed. If you truncate that off, you're only receiving the blue ray. And so in order to receive the highest level of initiation, you first have to go through the blue ray. And that is what is arced through the brain in the center of the third eye, directly into the cave of Brahma, triggering what one would call the phosphorus responses in the pineal gland and the pituitary gland. Those both working hand in hand to recreate a visual language that now gives you an experience of an altered state of consciousness. You are now initiated into an elixir created in the brain by energy that was harnessed by the archetypal structure. Now, we have those fields of energy around the body as well.
Okay, please go on.
So it was also determined, again, we were talking about calcium and how we resonate with that.
Yes.
There are many substances out there that create geometry. Now we have to go back into what creates.
In fact, every substance has geometry because you're talking about the chemical bonds.
That's right.
And that. structure.
In the beginning of creating...
If they only taught chemistry like this.
That's right. And
I'd
I
be a
often
genius.
wondered, why not?
I know, because this is where it lives.
Let me
Go
begin
on.
to simply for our audience how transmutation took place.
Okay.
To create what we would call like maybe a one density or initial frequency, we go back to the mundane egg that we began to explain in the archetypal structure of the earlier lessons of sacred geometry.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when it begins to grow upon itself, it's going to congeal other matter towards it. And the principle that I like to use would be best set forth by Buckminster Fuller in what he terms to be his close packing of spheres.
Mm-hmm.
It's this little geometry here which uniquely, all aspects of it, allow for a beautiful, harmonious pattern that gives us many different ways to interpret this. This is called the close packing of spheres.
Mm-hmm.
This particular close packing of spheres is as if I gave everyone 13 marbles and they closely packed it together. What one would discover was we'd all come up with the same shape and form. And the shape and form is indeed what is termed to be the vector equilibrium or the cube octahedron. Vector meaning that all vectors will equalize because they have the ability to collapse and expand. And the cube octahedron is because it is created by the 6 faces of the square faces of the cube, or the 8 triangles which recreate the octahedron. And the archetypal vectors that allow for this geometry to unfold and transmute all the others is based upon these vectors in the shape and form having the ability by natural law to rotate and compress and constantly be jitterbugging in the universe and taking it back to the simplest archetypal structures, tetrahedron back into the mundane egg of movement, back into the finite point. So this structure is the unfoldment that allows for hydrogen to unfold into the transmutation of what is determined to be the 92 elements in our natural periodic table. And to explain this a little bit fuller and quickly,
Yes.
the next frequency layering beyond this would be a simple mathematics. If this is 1 times 10 plus 2, the next layer of frequency would be 2 times 2 times 10 plus 2, which meant 42 around 12 around 1. And the next layer of frequency would be 3 times 3 times 10 plus 2, which would mean 92 around 42 around 12 around 1.
Mm-hmm.
And hence what you would have is the same geometry unfolding only in a greater frequency. With that, we have now established the natural periodic table which unfolds and stabilizes third density grid that we all survive within. And from that came our principles of the vegetable and mineral kingdoms, and incidentally is also the pronucleus, which is that of the shape of the uranium molecule. The same 92 around 42, around 12, around 1, this geometry is the highest aspect of the natural periodic table. But to go beyond that, we're in an evolutionary state. We're in between establishing this and the fourth density or fourth dimensional experience. We have already located and harnessed the geometry of 140 plus elements now, although academic science will tell you that all of these unstable, artificially created elements are maybe perhaps up to 109, they're telling you, are unstable in this reality. But to harness the other geometries that create and will eventually establish our fourth dimensional reality are contained within fields of energy that are already fourth dimensional. So when the 162nd element is completely stable, the fourth density reality will unfold a new principle that allows us to interact and already be present in the fourth dimension.
And that is unfolding so-called
As we speak.
of itself,
Yes.
as part of some grand pattern.
Well, the Earth is an attractor, just like we were talking about antenna, bringing in
Right.
cosmic radiation.
Okay.
The higher cosmic
So as we
radiation-
continue, we individuals continue to attract higher level energies, because our four chakras, I mean, as one way of putting it, are opening and receiving, and our brain chemistry is acting as an attractor, as a magnet, as a magnetic field, basically, at one pole. We are helping the planet move into the fourth dimensional space.
Yes.
Okay, so that's our role in it. And I'm just kind of summing up, because we're running out of time, most unfortunately, which isn't real, it's only an illusion, but nonetheless, we're going to cut this off in a minute. The use of certain certain nutrients, such as the white powder of gold and others, but that in particular, will help to accelerate that process of crystallizing the brain into a new geometry, which will act as a greater attractor, and at the same time open up our fields of consciousness to be dipping into the fourth and experiencing I and thou as one, etc., etc.
Yes. To simply put, where I think we're leading with all of this is to understand a certain aspect of what really is coherent in the body. Remember, hydrogen is 1. Carbon is 6, oxygen is 8. When you place any of the three together, you create harmonious music or patterns that allow for geometry in the body as nutrition. When you establish every one of these as being a separate universe unto its own, we need to ingest every portion of this. But some have harmonic properties that allow for the hormone secretions in the body to assimilate that and trigger it and recreate brain chemistry. And they happen to be the rare elements and the platinum group elements, as well as the higher aspect and the higher end of towards uranium. We need to ingest, even if it's 1 or 2 atoms of every element that's natural to us. And most of this is lost, but only found through the technology of the creation of certain plants and minerals. They know how to mine it out of the soil. We haven't quite figured out which plants
Do what?
Do what until we discover through the alchemical texts of what we would term to be the materia medica of ancient Egypt, that they recombined certain plants to recreate certain chemistries. They understood it all. One important function is combining, congealing harmonious patterns in the plants and the mineral worlds to recreate what is always in the body first, but we forgot, because the higher functions of the brain now have to be triggered to remember. And when we trigger this, the body responds, and we'll do it naturally.
Wow. Thank you so much. I hate cutting this off. Would you be on again at another time when we've got more time?
I will always be available for you.
Thank you, Chelsea. You're beautiful. Thank you.
Oh, there's so much to pull into, and I didn't do anything.
This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World. Thanks so much for joining us. Give a call at 212-420-0800 and learn how you can connect with more information like this. Look forward to seeing you all next week. Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and we're very glad that you're joining us again today. We are continuing on with Chelsea Flor, who has an extensive background in the understanding of sacred sciences, coming to us from ancient Atlantis, Lemuria, Egypt, the Hebrews, Tibet, and elsewhere. Basically, she has come to understand some of the underlying principles that are the basis of life and the formation of matter. So we've been going into this in some detail in the last couple of shows, and today we're going to continue on in particular about the nature of brain chemistry and what kind of potential we have as human beings activating our entire nervous system with the introduction of certain kinds of nutrients that, interestingly, were spoken about and discussed at length in detail in very ancient texts. So Chelsea, thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you again.
Yeah, we're having fun, aren't we?
We are.
So when we talk about the maximization of the brain and its potential and the size of our brain, which is so underutilized, which we can tell quickly by looking around our planet and seeing that things aren't going so well, based on how they could go. What do you propose we do to remedy the situation?
It's all going to come down to chemistry and nutrition. And with this will come the principles that we are all understanding to be the unfoldment of man. And a good way to interpret all this would be, first let's look at the pre-states of matter. If our essence came into a physical...
So are you saying that our consciousness is a result of chemistry and nutrition?
It's a result of spirit taking on the form of flesh, animating the flesh, and now activating the flesh to become one with spirit.
Mm-hmm.
So with this comes a whole alchemical process of taking the body with you.
Right.
So returning back.
Physical immortality,
yes,
as it were.
Right.
So just to go over this point just one more time, because there seems like there's a reciprocity between consciousness creating so-called the laws of chemistry and nutrition, and on the other side of it, that nutrition and chemistry are informing and, in a sense, and forming consciousness.
Well,
is it reciprocal?
It is reciprocal, but the two are really hand in hand. Were created at the same time, only we became separate, and we became separate to the source of it all, which was what we call the Godhead, and where it all came from. When matter began to congeal out of the ethers and to create these marvelous universes that we call third density for us as a physical vehicle to experience life
as in
on,
third dimension.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
What we came to understand is that there was very coherent laws and patterns that were immutable, that were identifiable only maybe through the language of math or the language of waveform, or to be interpreted as the only way that things can get done is laws of God, the immutable way.
I see. And those laws are?
Well, one way of looking at it are principles of seven. How many times we talk about the seven laws, the seven natures, the seven unfoldments of man?
Gurdjieff refers to the law of seven.
Yes. This came from the spin axis of the wonderful archetypal structure of the tetrahedron. Most people understand this to have 4 points, such as in your basic principle of the tetrahedron. The vortex contained within is a 3.5 spin from apex to the 90-degree flat base, and this archetypal structure has the ability, like an octahedron or a pyramid, to pull apex in on itself and duplicate itself, which meant in the jitterbug effect of the last show we talked about, the collapsing of the octahedron and the cube having that growth period of expansion and contraction. From this came the ethereal fire, which became the archetypal structure of what we call the lines and vertices that congeal matter, such as in what we call crystallography, and the wonderful crystals that we see, the facets created by that. These are principal laws. But how this came to be in the first place was based upon wave and spin. Naturally, we see that there are 4 points here, so we would think in terms of 4 spin axes. But truly, the tetrahedron is nothing more than a half-stellated octahedron, and we find this archetypal structure here by truncating equal aspects off of this. And contained within is our octahedron, which give you the additional 3 spin axes. So, hence we have the 7 basic laws of spin and waveform. From this came every principle of matter congealing, meaning that this is an affinity principle of the way that certain geometry adheres to one another. And to understand, again, the archetypal structure of this center in between is a stellation principle of the unfoldment and collapsing of this, how geometry and chemistry, now remember every chemical is a geometry, adheres would be face to face, point to point, or edge to edge. And the way it combines would give us these wonderful molecules such as this, giving us close packing of spheres or the square packing of spheres, meaning the cube or the octahedron, And however it chooses to do this and create an affinity principle is the way that the chemicals or the elements of the periodic table begin to adhere to one another based upon placement and atomic number. In other words, if you knew that you had 8 particles, the only way that the
of a given
of any
element,
of even a pre-states of matter, 8 would be determined to be something cubical. If you had 13, you would have this.
I see.
If you had...
It's just going to form that way.
That's right. It's going to congeal and through affinity create a combination that allows for a particular geometry to be coherent. And with this comes a wave which creates a sound, which creates a coherent pattern of color. And as we begin to take the subharmonics into the overtones, we have the complete electromagnetic spectrum, which is cosmic radiation from its subtlest principle to the magnificent light bodies that we will transmute and take with us from spirit back to home.
Wow. Spirit back to home.
Yes, back and return to the source, which is the Godhead.
With our physical bodies intact.
Absolutely.
If we do it that way.
If we choose to. But that is the complete evolution of the vehicle. And in essence, means that every wonderful creation that we see out there is, we came from somewhere and we will evolve to the wondrous stars that we see in the heavens and us actually birthing galaxies. So that is where we have come from, and that is where we go.
Fascinating. So are you saying that the fullest flowering of humanity is to return to source, originally ignited by spirit into physical form, and then take our physical form back to source?
Yes.
So we are at one, in resonance, in harmony with source, but maintaining the grossness, so to speak, or the three-dimensionality of a physical form nonetheless.
That's right. And even in our small embodiment of this physical vehicle, we radiate light. If we had the complete embodiment of the matter contained within a star, we would be equally as radiant as that star.
Wow.
So getting back to brain chemistry.
Yes.
There is a long process in accomplishing this as a feat of evolution. And so there are sciences developed to teach and aid and create tools with which we will use to transmute and evolve the human physical vehicle. And with this comes, again, learning what chemistry is and how we can apply that to the physical being. And throughout our recent time period, we have heard the many rumors of the white powder gold. And discussing what perhaps David Hudson's school of thought might be.
Right. I've met him and spoken to him at length about it.
In correspondence to that of the ancient doctrines, we have many things to look at here. David Hudson did bring up some very interesting points, but he called what his so-called monatomic, which is actually a small cluster of geometry. It's not really monatomic. It's the smallest cluster that allows a coherent principle to be intact, to be called an element, such as if there were 8 small particles that created that of rhodium. Things of this nature. It has to be the smallest geometry. When we use fire assays for disaggregation of organic or mineral content of our periodic table, what we do is we disaggregate the original lattice structure and purify it and bring it to a state of what we would call the original geometry. Now, there are certain aspects already contained in nature that do this automatically. And the ancients termed this to be the black alkaloid stone. The stone, black from Abydos, used to wash its particles into the soil every year that the Nile would flood. And the great plains of the Giza Plateau hence had the most marvelous, richest soil of any area known in that time period. And with it came a harvest every month which corresponded to a flower.
Was this black sand then?
This was black alkaloid substance, which would be given not on top of the sand necessarily, but the plains, which was very fine particle silt. And the silt is where the wonderful plants were grown. And every month corresponded to a plant, which, hence we have a flower for every month in our tradition.
Yes.
And every flower corresponded to a gem, which hence we have stones and things of this nature. But truly what that was represented was the waveform and the tonal quality and the light and color property of what we call the Urim and Thummim, the breastplates of the high priest of Egypt, and the communication devices that went interdimensional. We had to contain all of these gems in some principle within our body, as if we were to dissect the octave into 12 cohesive parts, which is like a diatonic scale in music, containing all the 7 color keys, white keys, and the black keys. You have 7 plus 5, which is 12, segmenting the octave, which is, again, a metaphor for the music of man. So containing these principles within the body, we are now to take the 7 gems, congeal it. Now remember, we have more than 7 chakras of the body. We have 5 overtones that we call the hidden 12 chakras, which are above the crown chakra. With that comes the most coherent light bodies surrounding that of the body that we call the etherical principles. When the 5 additional chakras are activated, also the brain is illuminated into the higher aspects of what we call the 7 principles of activating the pituitary and the pineal gland into those principles of firing those neurons, into receiving cosmic radiation and interpreting this into wonderful elixirs created in the brain by way of harmony.
Wow, which is basically the communication of hormonal substances with each other.
Indeed, and I'm glad you understand that. We contained it all within the body. We just forgot how to create the jump start that allows for the triggering effect for us to unfold. And this is done through the elixirs of the ancients, which is why it was termed In Search of the Fountain of Youth, or the Philosopher's Stone, or the many modalities out there that allow for this transformation.
I hear you. You know, I'm just hearing in my ear for the first time, Chelsea, the relationship of the word elixir to the word electrical. And when you use the phrase jumpstart, what we do with an automobile is to jumpstart it with an electrical current from one pole to the other. So what is it that we forgot, and what is the elixir now electrifying in the body that we sort of left behind?
Well,
Behind. Oh yes, that's no doubt. It relates to the sacrum.
yes, indeed.
Behind. Yeah.
Let's just back it up
Sure.
one little step. The word El, E-L.
Yeah.
Anything in nature that was chosen to have a tonal quality that allowed for electric, or electrum, or Elohim,
Or Michel.
or Majel, that either ended or
Yeah.
began in El, you're going to have what you call the light and the dark principles coming together. And this was also contained within the syntax of what we call all of our hierarchical angels, as well as what you would want to term to be the Luciferian or the Elsiferian effect. The letter L is a 90-degree shift, meaning
Yeah.
the perpendicular waveform from the apex to the base of the beginning, the etherical fire.
Sure.
Yes.
Okay.
Which is why they say you need to take a 90-degree shift in consciousness in order to transcend. There are metaphors there to give you an indication that they were meaning something else.
Yeah.
Light, Elohim, all of the principles in that particular collection of words gave you the electricity for illumination.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Thanks for connecting that. And El and Al etymologically are the origins, of course, Elohim, but of God.
Absolutely.
El and Al, both, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anyway, please go on.
Okay, so how does this interpret into what one would do to begin the process?
Right. What is it through the introduction of the white powder of gold or other nutrients? What is it that is happening, and what is going on in the brain that allows us to enter the fourth dimensional reality.
Okay, to jump-start it, as we use that term, there is a process of certain disciplines that should be, which should correspond to doing this. To undergo an initiation, one would want to have a very clean body, meaningly and internally. And this is usually done by a period of fasting. And by fasting, you shut down all of the digestive enzymes that eat up, like Pac-Man, some of the wonderful natural substances that are present in the body. To give you an indication,
That's interesting.
when certain enzymes are released, it is a triggering fact to destroy serotonin in the body. And serotonin is the light synthesizer that allows for one to have communication between us and the source greater than us.
Oh.
And so that's just one example.
Yes.
When you shut down the digestive juices and the enzymatic principles that we think are just, metabolic or whatever, you are stopping time as we stand. You are purging the body of toxins, and you're continuing on a process of hoping that when that shuts down, all the hormones will squeeze out their precious jewels and begin a triggering effect of cascading and creating what I call a cosmic soup in the spinal column, in that wonderful fluid that eventually raises through a heat process.
Cerebrospinal fluid or
Yes.
Kundalini? Okay.
And creates, is the Kundalini.
Yeah.
And so...
We have another cosmic visitor.
Yes. And so every time we talk about the wonderful adaptation that nature has provided us as nutrition, we want to correspond the harmonic with harmony to that of what
The
in
etymology
nature,
is the same of those
that's
two
right.
words, yeah.
What in nature is represented with what the body contains. And the geometry, and if you go by perhaps the Eastern tradition, they'll tell you that your chakras correspond to geometry, mainly because they emanate a certain field based upon that. Now, to intake a nutrition that has the geometry in its monoatomic structure would be a resonant factor and a triggering effect based upon, in nature, how this occurs. And so it just brings me such delight to be able to begin to tell the story.
It's an incredible story, and it makes for laughing. It's incredible. So, what is the physiology of laughter?
Joy, sheer joy.
Which shoots up the spinal column, down cascading over into the third eye. Yeah.
We are creating a cosmic elixir in the brain, call it the cosmic soup. And this is illuminating the cave of Brahma into that wonderful golden bowl and the blossoming of the lotus flower.
How is this related to the Hindu description of nectar and ambrosia being released in the mouth and in the brain?
One and the same, indeed. See, when ambrosia is released in the mouth, what some people don't understand is that the first conduit of electricity, the first meridian, is when the tongue touches the roof of the mouth, which is why certain breaths allow for that to occur when utilizing certain mudras and certain coherent functions of waveform based upon principles of movement of energy with your hands, which is why a light body healer is intuitively instructing the hands to do the light body work. So the body already has these principles coherent there, and so when the connection is made, then you emanate the blossomy smell or odor of these wonderful
Fragrance.
flowers. Fragrance would be a much better term, yes. And it's often been said that when one has the presence of the wonderful scent of certain flowers out there, they are in the presence of the light. They have taken on the new light body and are walking in between worlds, so to speak, interdimensionally.
So, upon cleansing the vehicle through detoxification, fasting, prayer, meditation, and readying the body for this next step of awakening the Kundalini and, very specifically the cerebrospinal fluid in Western conversation.
Yes.
Yes.
Indeed.
then this is a magical substance. I mean, I knew it for a long time, even though they don't think about it that way because they're busy being doctors. It's really a magical substance, and it is literally bathing the brain in some of the substances that you're referring to.
Mm-hmm.
And this happens actually naturally, but you were saying, and I'm just kind of encapsulating, we've missed some of the jump start. But in fact, even some of the purification rituals begin to jumpstart the body. Is that so?
Yes, but like I said, shutting down the digestive tract and all of
Already
the enzymes
begins to allow the serotonin to play its more natural course.
That's right. So you synthesize light, number one.
I see. So in a sense, you're digesting light. So you get a chance almost to...
Prana.
So what you're able to do, if you shut down the grosser elements of ingestion that we usually eat as food, you are opening yourself up to the possibility of ingesting the higher level elements like light, prana, chi.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And with that, again, I mean, it's been said if you fast, you want to eat air balls. What does the atmosphere contain that the body needs to synthesize into recreating reconstruction of the body?
Oxygen.
Hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. We eat, consume only those four elements. Those four elements, when recombined, reconstruct every aspect of the body.
Yeah.
So it's almost like saying
You're restructuring the body.
The rest is waste. And the only other aspect that we need is to ingest minerals. And the minerals we can get from water that is alive. And you only need the smallest tiny particles, subatomic, naturally, which is why we talk about colloidals out there.
It's incredible. So you're saying on a diet of air and water,
Yes, that's it.
one attains the highest cerebrospinal circulation.
Yes, indeed. And the rest...
And brain activation.
And the rest is enjoyment of just indulging in
The earthly plane.
the earthly pleasures of taste, smell, touch, all of our senses.
Right.
And then we hope to activate the higher senses through that. It's almost like being able to transmute everything that you put in your body to the highest principle. When you understand that it can be done, then eventually you will probably have a lack for food or a lack for anything other than water and prana.
Right. And what's also interesting, Chelsea, is that because we are operating in a polarity consciousness, by and large, on planet Earth, even when one steps into the fourth dimension, one's still operating on some level in duality. When one goes without the ordinary earthly pleasures for a while, when one decides to come back to them, they're so rich.
It's like gaining innocence again, because
Yeah.
you're now at a higher level to be able to
Exactly.
enjoy them.
You get the polarity of being without, the abstinence, and then when you have, it's just a feast.
Well, hopefully you're born again into reconstructing the body and of taking that energy at the highest level possible.
Absolutely. It's incredible. So it's we're talking about food of the gods.
Indeed, and with that comes gold of the gods, and the many different
Yeah.
elixirs out there created to be that which we need to trigger and create an altered state of consciousness, which gives you the function of a higher waveform. And when you can experience altered states, then the body remembers how to map that consciousness. It's how to get here, from here to there.
And so you're also cutting new circuitry at the same time. I mean, it's happening on several different levels.
It has to, because if
Yeah.
you develop one without the other, and you cannot integrate it, then you become either too ethereal, or too mental, or too emotional, or too physical.
That's right.
And the embodiment of spirituality encompasses them all.
That's right. It's incredible. It's incredible. We're three-brained beings, so to speak. So
Seven
each
brain beings.
7.
There's an unfoldment of the highest principle there. Indeed.
Oh, 7. Okay, so
7 levels to the brain.
okay. And right now you're referring to our really having activated, by and large, for most people, 3?
That's right, corresponding to the 3 lower chakras.
Right.
Those that have illuminated the body with the energy emanating from unconditional love of the heart chakra have now triggered an alchemical effect within the body that allows for that chemistry in the brain to envelop and develop the higher aspects that were already there from the beginning.
So it's more than even developing, it's really more invoking, evoking, eliciting, activating.
Remembering. Yeah.
Remembering, exactly.
Who we are.
Bringing back those members, right.
That's right.
Oh,
And
my.
with that also activates the light bodies, the subtle energy bodies outside of the body that begin to function in ways that we were not aware we ever had the capacity to do, which means the center of gravity becomes lighter. You take on a more illuminated effect, and your auric fields become brighter. And those that have the ability to see will be able to interpret that. Those that have the psychic energy to feel will just be noticeable while you're in their presence.
Yep.
And, there are so many wonderful effects of just getting beyond the mundane into a higher function of the brain. The rest will come forth.
Indeed. Indeed. It's just awesome, and I really appreciate your articulation of these points, and as well as just want to commend you for your detailed study, both intellectual and intuitive, or intuitive receiving.
Not to mention the practical aspects, actually experiencing what chemistry can do as nutrition when ingested into the body, and to be the active principle for jump-starting this when we don't fully have the discipline to get there all by ourselves.
We're only human, but humanity is taking on a whole new sensibility right now.
That's right.
Unfortunately, we're out of that linear idea that we entertain so closely to our hearts called time. And I just want to thank you again for your wonderful contribution that you're making to us all.
Thank you again for having me.
Absolutely. This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World. Thanks so much for joining us. We've been speaking with Chelsea Flor about, well, you heard it, and continue we will. Please give me a call at 212-420-0800. Share your thoughts and feelings with me. I love hearing from you, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.